now that our numbers have gone up, I hope you're all sitting there with a cup of tea. We're going to get started on the webinar today. So what I'd love to do is first thank you all for joining us. We're really excited for this particular webinar, which is all around learning in the flow of work, enabling autonomous learners in the modern work environment. Okay, so to give you a rundown and an introduction, my name's Emma Bamford and I'm going to be hosting today. By way of topic introduction, essentially the fourth industrial revolution is upon us, and how that's characterized is by the sheer velocity and scope of fusional breakthroughs supported by technology. And if we compare this with previous industrial revolutions, breakthroughs are evolving exponentially rather than at a linear pace. We're seeing a key trend in the development of information consumption and technology-enabled platforms, which are creating entirely new ways of consuming in the process. What that means is it alters the professional environments of workers and how we access and consume information as a whole. So what does this actually mean for our learners? We know from LinkedIn's Learning's most recent workplace learning report that intense digitization is creating an upskilling and reskilling revolution. Couple this with the fact that on average, workers have only 24 minutes per week to dedicate to formal learning, which equates to about 1% of their typical work week. How are we making the best use of their time in methods that meet their preferences for consuming information whilst meeting ever-evolving business needs? So in this webinar, we're going to be focusing on how we enable the autonomous learner in the modern work environment through learning in the flow of work. And I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our speakers today. I'm really excited to introduce Benny Ramos, who is our Global Solution Practice Director at Skillsoft. And we also have Dan Fish here at Go1 as Director of Strategy. So welcome both for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma.
Great to be here. And also thanks to Benny for jumping on.
Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, let's get the discussion underway, shall we? Okay. So first of all, there'll be some people here present who will already have an understanding of what learning in the flow of work means. We've touched on the wider trend of consuming in the process, about that autonomous consumption. So how does learning in the flow of work tie into this concept? And what does it mean for those that are new to it?
Well, I'm happy for me to take that.
For sure, for sure. Well, when you think of learning in the flow of work, maybe just a couple of the drivers. When you think of the drivers over the last couple of years, we know that digital transformation that you mentioned, Emma, is driving innovation, of course, and efficiencies. But more recently, when you think of COVID and what's happened in terms of investment, not only in technology, but learning, we're now looking at learning as a driver for business continuity and safety. So how do we do this? Have we gotten extra time to do this? No, actually we have less time. So learning can't be an event. Learning can't be something that is just happening once a month, once every quarter, once a year, which is normally what happens with things like leadership and development training. But it has to happen not only, you think about learning about the job, you are learning on the job and you're learning in the job. And there's going to be different technologies and different ways and best practices that'll facilitate that. But that is really what we're thinking about is really feeding that notion of a culture of learning and continuous learning. And there's going to be lots of reasons for that Dan and I will probably touch on today. So Dan, maybe your views of course on that.
Yeah, look, I think just feeding on from that, I think it's a really interesting one for me because I think it more often than not it's technology, but it also lends itself to some of the physical components like location and space, you know, with regards to where the learner currently is, both physically and from a career perspective. I think the big thing for me, though, and Benny touched on it, is around the sort of autonomy to be able to consume content where and when the learners need it. So rather than them be shackled to a specific platform, like as traditionally we would see, such as a learning management system, giving them the freedom and the ability to engage at the right time. So, you know, just some examples of that, I guess, if we think about the sales function for an organization, you know, where might they tend to spend a lot of their time, you know, technologically, probably wouldn't be an LMS day to day, more likely to be a CRM like Salesforce. So being able to surface meaningful content around within that technology is really critical. And there's some obvious ways to be able to do that. You know, if you think about a salesperson looking at deals that might be stalling beyond the 90-day terms, you know, being able to pop up some content around, you know, how to close the deal might be beneficial. Likewise, I guess with, you know, if we think about customer success managers sort of talking to their internal product teams and, you know, trying to get a solution for a client that's reached out, you know, the chances are they'll be in Slack or Teams. So, you know, are we able to surface meaningful learning experiences through that platform? And again, even for manufacturing and, you know, people in those types of industries, there'll be workplace safety technologies like safety culture, for example, where it absolutely makes sense to be able to surface some meaningful learning experiences. So I think it's a combination of sort of that right place, right time, and the existing tech stack that an organization will have.
Yeah, and overall, again, coming back to this whole idea of the fourth industrial revolution with AI, machine learning, the whole idea that it's kind of like the iPod and the music came at the right time because the internet enabled it. Here we have the technology enabling really working in the flow of work, learning in the flow of work. When you have the idea of the consumer tendencies that people have, people understand Netflix, they understand Amazon, they understand YouTube, and really that type of, you know, the technologies behind those platforms really are going to enable people to learn in the flow of work. And technology is going to enable the scalability, the consistency of the message that perhaps classroom training or event-based training synchronously might not be able to. So if we think of the help button on Word or PowerPoint, those are the types of things that people are expecting, and those are the types of things that people are going to need, not only performance today, but, you know, there's a huge concern about employability for the future. So learning those 24 minutes a day, or sorry, 24 minutes a week is going to be important, not just to drive you know, efficiencies and performance for the organization today, but, you know, at the employee level, the worker level, they're much more concerned, and it's magnified with COVID and folks who might be concerned about being fully employed with their work skills and mindsets for the future as well.
Yeah, and I like the reference to the sort of the Netflixes and so on. I think, you know, if we think, I think that as well as the technology, there's a mindset shift in this as well. And, you know, if we think about how some of our employees and these learners will be consuming media and data outside of the workforce, you know, the question is, how they then consume that digital experience, if it is in fact digital or blended within the learning context, is that the same? And I'd argue that we even though there is the opportunity to provide that similar type of experience, you know, the curation, the aggregation, I don't think it's something that we necessarily adopt wholeheartedly right now. And I think that there's another component, just, you know, on that as a bit of a watch out, I'd suggest as well, when we think about learning in the flow of work particularly, and that's sort of with in relation to sort of this concept of learning in the flow of life as well. And I think there's a big component when we think about the two, and for me, that's really around data at the moment. So when we think about, for example, the portability of that data and how, you know, when we think about important components like empowering the learner, what they're able to do with that, I think there's still this sort of hemmed in component of learning in the flow of work. That means that if I move organizations, or if I move geographies or change roles or organizations, how much of that data, how much of that insight is actually able to come with me. And I think this is an interesting dynamic between this concept of learning in the flow of work and sort of more so in the flow of life. And you know, because I think it's critical from a flow of work perspective that we're enabled to take some ownership of that data and use it sort of from a lifelong perspective. And I think that's just probably one of the watch outs that I've sort of think about when it comes to this concept of learning in the flow of work.
No, for sure. It's fair. And I think you're touching on a couple of things. We're touching on the how and the what. So the how of what makes learning in the flow of work effective. And it's going to be things like micro learning, little snippets. It's going to be enabling the use of multiple devices and multiple modalities, because you might be on a train, or you might be driving, or you might be cycling, and you're not going to be watching a video when that happens. You're probably going to be listening, or it might be that you can watch a video, but you need those deep concepts. So you need to be reading. And so it really does appeal to different types of people, different, places. And again, the different geographies, different time zones, a lot of these technologies can overcome that. But then it's the what is important. And honestly, if we looked back over the last couple of years, what's interesting is everyone's had this deep expertise in whatever they're doing. It could be sales, it could be HR, it could be operations, and so on. But two things have actually come about in terms of what's really coming up in terms of bubbling to the top of interest. So last spring, I actually did a blog post because my organization, and I'm a little bit prejudiced in saying that we do a lot of these things very well, but our organization and what we're talking about is actually kind of technology agnostic. But when we were looking at technology organizations and what the most requested type of content was all around how do I engage and lead virtually, which is quite interesting because a lot of technology-based teams at that point in time, about 57 to 58% of teams were working outside of a traditional office. And now with COVID, and because of the limitations of the ability to work in close proximity, that number is quite high. So what we're seeing is that's accelerating. On the other side, those who are not in the technology organization are looking again back to the fourth industrial revolution and trying to understand how do we use these technologies of RPA, machine learning, blockchain, and so on. So from a business perspective, they're trying to get a lot more acumen in digital transformation. And many organizations are going through trying to decide and trying to determine how best to use these technologies and how to best have it incorporated to support their business models and their culture. So it's really interesting in terms of what's bubbling up. But most recently, of course, coming back to the distraction factor, I just wanted to point out that we do work a lot with MIT Sloan, and much of our content is embedded and co-created, in fact, with MIT Sloan, and they just provided us with a list of the most recently or frequently accessed articles, MIT Sloan articles in the last 60 days. And these are telling. Number one was the new leadership playbook for the digital age, rethinking global supply chains, managing stress and emotions while working remotely, and lastly, how to help employees work from home with kids. So if you think, if we're not already distracted by the fact that we have so many different things happening and work happening, now we're working at home and we have dinner to make and kids all around and all sorts of different things that might not have been in our work environment previously. So there's this whole mix coming back to your idea of geography and distance and so on of your team members. It's also the situations are much broader and wider now than what we might have seen in a typical office environment.
Totally right.
So I'm not sure if we answered the question, Emma, but hopefully we can.
You provided me a perfect segue, Benny. So we have touched on some of the challenges there, but I'm keen to kind of explore that a bit further. Obviously, we have so much information available to us now, and we have those far more flexible and often remote working arrangements. Alongside that, we know that around 50% of learners say they don't have time to learn at work. despite 94% of them saying that they see the career benefits of making the time to learn. So how does that add up? What are some of the challenges to modern learners that are emerging against well-established challenges of the recent past?
I think it's this is a really interesting one for me, because I think the very thing that's helping to evolve our learning experiences has the potential to challenge it as well, right? So, and in particular, I'm thinking about the data and the distraction that this can cause. So, you know, if I was to ask people on this webinar if they woke up this morning pining for more emails and Slack messages, more comments on their sort of LinkedIn or Facebook pages, I'd suggest that the answer to that would be no. I think people are already feeling quite overwhelmed and with the amount of data that they're consuming on a day-to-day basis. Now, you know, perhaps an even more pertinent question would be, you know, given that that's the case, how many people on the webinar would have lamented this and gone and done it anyway, interacted with that feed, looked at these emails, checked these random messages? And so, you know, when I think about that, it helps for me anyway to highlight that, yes, people value this information, but the ability for people to be able to digest it is fast disappearing. So, you know, and I think if we also then factor in, you know, EMC's forecasts of around, I think just in this year alone, it's around 40 trillion gigabytes or 40 zettabytes will exist, and you know, or sorry, this, as of this year, it will exist, and 90% of that data total has been created over the last couple of years. So, you know, sort of factor that alongside the numbers from Digital 2019 that talks about the fact that 1.2 billion years of internet usage was done in 2019 alone. You know, that's a lot of data and distraction. So, you know, for me, the stuff that actually makes this really compelling is also what's going to end up becoming a massive distraction. I think when I factor in the exponential notion of data and information, it becomes really challenging, because I think if we think about the amount of data that's created and the amount of data that changes, what does that say for our knowledge base or what we're currently learning? Does that mean it's going to be obsolete in the next 5 years? And, you know, then you factor in some of the traditional models of learning and education, and you think about the concept of a 4-year degree, then, you know, it's quite possible that, you know, we start this 4-year degree, and by the time we finish it, some of the stuff that we've learned and some of the data that we've consumed is possibly out of date, right? So I think there's that component that sort of factors in from a challenge perspective.
No, for sure. And what you're talking about is entirely pertinent. A person by the name of Mitch Joel wrote a book called 6 Pixels of Separation. And he talked about, you know, he's actually talked publicly about this whole idea of impressions. So as recent as, you know, 2017 or so, executives and leaders in organizations had up to 70 impressions each day. And that was, what an impression is something that you had to react to. It could be a phone call, a text, an email, a notification from an application to approve expenses, to do something. And, you know, we're just a few years later, 3 years later, and it's over 100 impressions a day. So everyone's busy. Work gets in the way of learning, but learning is quite important, because if you listen to organizations like the World Economic Forum, they've indicated that almost 60% of all the jobs that we will all be doing in 2030 have not yet even been created yet. And moreover, the CLO of TD Bank had indicated at HR Tech that, or ATDTK, that the average job is only going to last 4 to 4.5 years. So the career of a person is going to consist of 27 to 28 jobs over the lifetime. And you have to be a lifelong learner, and it's not about the hard skills, but only it's going to be about mindsets around resiliency, agility, a growth mindset. And to feed that, you know, people are hungry. We actually did a study with Vance and Bourne and APAC, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia, and 2,500 professionals. They basically were very concerned. They were all getting training, But the training was all about how they perform today, not necessarily about the skills of the future. And coming back again, harkening back to that Industry 4.0 piece that we started out with, the technologies that we've all become accustomed to that have made us be able to be agile and to compete in different ways and have different customer experiences is going to significantly affect 1 out of 6 jobs. And each of those jobs can be perhaps replaced or augmented or changed very much by automation. And what do we do with these people? It's again, that balance of how much do we invest in today with all information that's required today, and how much do we invest in the future with all these people? 9 out of 10 people in this study we're concerned about their future employability, and we're wanting their employers to provide them more. So how do we provide them more? Do we make the day longer? Not necessarily. I think the good news is that education, learning and training and career development is not only can help performance, but can drive engagement. And if you think of that, the whole old Maslow's hierarchy, it helps us with the very bottom because it helps us get, a job that provides food and security and water and all that. But as we, get the training and are able to enable ourselves and be more sure of ourselves, and we self-actualize, it actually helps the top end of that hierarchy as well. So people will make the time for what's important. And at this point in time, there are a lot of people who believe employability is important, their future skill sets are important. And Gartner in 2019 did the digital workplace survey, and they rated countries digital dexterity, and the number one aspect was the willingness to learn. And they looked at Gen Z and the workforce, and they surveyed hundreds of people. And India was number 1, UK was number 2, and US was number 3. And it was all around this idea that people wanted to learn, they were hungry for that, and they were prepared to have many, many careers. So again, coming back to all that data that you're referring to, people will adapt. And I think for those who want to adapt, organizations have a number of tools that we can use to help them with that when we talk about learning in the flow of work. And of course, if you're not familiar or aware of how that can happen, there are experts out there that can help advise you, of course.
I think there's actually just a nice way to bring a couple of those points together. I mean, we've done a little bit of work, and to your point around the impact of technology in the future, I mean, just to sort of bring that to life and then contextualize that with the sort of what we're talking about today, which is this sort of autonomous learning or learning in the flow of work. I mean, we do some work with a great company here in Australia called Fathom AI, and part of their job is to sort of, both for government and big organizations, is to predict the impact of certain AI and automation on certain industries and skills. And one of the things that we talked with them about is this concept of accountancy, right? And it's not too difficult to imagine the impact that automation can have on some of those tasks that don't quite require the same amount of critical thinking, or just sort of numbers that can be processed. And one of the big things with that is, and this is what we're sort of talking about with this contextualization piece, is if those accountants know, and to your point a moment ago, Benny, if those accountants know and have the opportunity to access some of this insight to say, well, actually, you know what, yes, your jobs are going to be impacted, but you know what, there's these other jobs that exist out there. So I think it's something like 60% of the skill set that an accountant has lends itself really nicely to cybersecurity, to a cybersecurity analyst. Now, the good news with that is that a lot of that 60% is stuff that they already know, and the other 40% is more sort of IP that pertains to that type of role. So, not only is it this mindset of people being more inclined to learn, like if they have the right information and context at their fingertips to be able to drive some of that direction, it becomes really powerful, and at a societal level can be really helpful as well. So
no, for sure. And coming back, I indicated that the World Economic Forum said 1 out of every 6 jobs could be greatly impacted, but of those, a third of those folks who might have the right mindsets and competencies to easily transition into something else. So, good example is I'm a SQL DBA database analyst, and just a number of years ago, the titles of data wrangler and data scientist never existed. And those competencies and those skill sets that I was using as a DBA can easily transition. It's all around, the technology. Everyone can buy technology, but to unleash the technology, you need the people, and those people are, if they're willing and they're engaged, it is obviously, I don't know if you've read the paper Build versus Buy by Berzin, but it really just points out to the fact that in many instances, if you have an engaged individual, it's much cheaper for you to upskill them and train them than to hire from outside, given the fact that you already have someone who knows the culture, who has the connections in the organization, and the ramp up time is going to be much shorter. So, it's it's a kind of interesting thing that you're talking about in terms of if you have the right competencies and the right mindset, to adapt, of course.
Brilliant. And just to kind of hone in on, you've spoken about a study done with Skillsoft about the learners who had concerns about the being measured on their performance for the skills today that might not be there in the future. And I guess this also ties into what we've just spoken about with regard to identifying and being able to transition skills between jobs more seamlessly. But are contemporary kind of learning programs keeping up with this need and the speed here? We know that learners are more looking for self-directed learning. They want to have knowledge acquisition through search capability, the likes of Amazon, the likes of Google. But what does that actually mean for more traditional learning programs that may not capture that kind of information? It may not capture informal learning. What matters?
Yeah, of course, there are going to be different things that will support what we're talking about. We focused a little bit on the technology, but of course, mentorships are going to help. The ability, when you have a dispersed organization, to have personal learning networks, people that you can count on to buttress or to make up for any of your perhaps shortcomings if you need financial advice, if you need technical advice, and so on. Who are those people in your Rolodex? I'm aging myself a little bit when I say that, when I say Rolodex, but moreover, there is going to be, when you talk about the pertinence of organizations and the programs they have today. In our particular instance, we wanted to make sure, from a Skillsoft perspective, that the content we had was going to meet the needs of today's workforce. So we actually did some research with MIT and Accenture, and used fMRI and EEG to make sure that the content we were creating was actually going to be engaging people's brains and increasing the likelihood of memorization and the ability for them to apply it. So, what parts of the brain were being activated and how high the activation. So that's kind of the why, but also the what. More recently, again, we've partnered with MIT Sloan to ensure that the leadership content that we had was going to be pertinent for today. There's the idea that technology and leadership can't be separated, and we know that originally when we created our leadership program, for example, we vetted it through Wharton, and our digital transformation content was actually vetted through Gartner. So we wanted to make sure that the currency was there, and I think what's rewarding for us is that we validated this against something called, there's a project called Optimum from Google. And Google actually spent 2 years looking at what are the competencies and or mindsets or skill sets that would a new leader in their organization, which many hold in esteem and to say is very progressive, needed immediately. So when they say new leader, they meant not new to leading, but new in terms of currency today. And of the 10 competencies that they named, we actually are happy to say we had 10 of those as well, the same ones they were looking at, which was around diversity and leading with agility and understanding the digital transformation technologies and those types of things. So coming back to what are the concerns that organizations have? Of course, is alignment to their business strategy, but also forward looking and seeing that whatever organization they partner with, if they're partnering, or if they're creating their own content, is going to meet the needs of their particular audience and particular learners.
And I think for me at a macro level as well, like it's, we don't need to look too far to see that some of the traditional learning institutions and methodologies are struggling to keep up. And to a certain degree, this shouldn't be surprising, I think, because, a lot of these older, whether it's, the traditional K-12 or class-based models, etc., it's that they can't keep up with what's going on in the world. They're not agile enough to sort of pivot and just be as close to the cutting edge to be able to create something meaningful. So, and that's not to say that there is no place for it. I just think that it's, when we think about it in context of future of work and roles that don't currently exist, and to Benny's point earlier, thinking about jobs that are now here that weren't 5 years ago, how do you start to train for some of that stuff? How do you start to educate at a broader level on these types of opportunities? So I think there's that one component. But then if I also think about my point earlier around this concept of, traditional award-based education and training, the idea that I'd go back to or someone would go back to university to do a 4-year degree. And, I was just reading the other day, Google launching their Google Career Certificate, where, these institutions, these big organizations are looking at recognizing a 3 to 6 month certificate versus a 4-year degree for certain job types. And so
absolutely,
it's really interesting because, and Benny and I have talked about this before. I mean, I have a hypothesis around the role that business will play in the future of education. And some of that we're already starting to see now from a disruptive nature. So you'll have a number of people where, you do this 3 to 6 month certificate and you're able to then look at a job and gain the relevant skills, and it's all highly contextualized and personalized. And so I think, the traditional environments for learning need to be able to adapt to some of this thinking. Otherwise it's difficult.
No, for sure. And whatever you're doing, I mean, they have a successful model that's feeding their talent framework. Over 30% of the roles and jobs apparently at Google, if you believe the media, are filled with folks who don't have a university degree. They were able to learn coding. They were able to learn different types of technologies outside of a traditional, post-secondary institution. And what was really, really important for them was to have some sort of credentials or certifications. And what's happening right now, not just in post-secondary institutions, but organizations like ourselves, we're using blockchain-enabled certificates. So there's efficacy not only for the learner, so that they can show perhaps on their LinkedIn profile or their CV in a verifiable way that they've completed and understand certain types of content. But believe it or not, 27% of people admitted to lying on their LinkedIn, profiles. So, if we think forward looking, there will be an easy way and a verifiable way with blockchain to validate. And it's a great way not only from the standpoint of learning and development overall, but for talent, management, looking at who has what certifications, if you're going to RFPs to deliver to a client, a customer, and so on, you can see what's happening in your organization from a learning standpoint. So this idea, learning doesn't have to happen it can happen in those institutions, but technologies that we're talking about can make learning much more efficient and effective. And it doesn't have to be, again, back to the effective. I've used this analogy before, or the story before. Wouldn't it be great if prior to my first critical conversation as a leader that I can watch, I had my leadership training, 6, 8, 10 months ago, and wouldn't it be great if I could watch a 3-minute video reminding me of the important aspects to be communicating effectively prior to that first critical conversation that I haven't had before. So it's just, there are possibilities, of course, for what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Perfect. So just kind of summarizing some of the points we've spoken about, if we were to provide advice for our L&D professionals here on the call today, we know that the future of learning is looking more fluid, but what does it mean for measuring the outcomes? What advice would you give them if they're wanting to adopt the principles of learning and the flow of work as part of their strategy? to improve engagement and outcomes for their learners?
I think it's, I think on the ROI piece, it's a bit of a holy grail when it comes to sort of L&D and organizational development. I actually remember being at a perspectives conference, something Skillsoft put on, probably back in 2013, 2014, and they had a great client presentation on exactly this topic. But the thing that I loved about it is that they were really transparent and frank up front, saying this isn't short term, like it's not something that happens overnight, and it requires both commitment from the organization to stay the course when it thinks about learning, but also to be able to report back on it. And so, you know, it's for me, it's a combination of things. I mean, there's the bottom line, and this particular client of Skillsoft talked about it. It was, you know, 2 to 3 year sales training initiative that they were able to see picked up the performance and over time impacted the bottom line, and that was great. I think there's other components now though where employees and learners are going to vote with their feet, right? So it's either, you know, the attraction numbers that the organizations are able to talk to, it's the retention numbers that people are able to talk to, and you know, the engagement of people while they're with you. And so I think, you know, Benny and I were talking the other day about this, and he had some great data points around, you know, the factors of, you know, what it will take to pull someone away if they're feeling fulfilled from a developmental perspective with an organization. I can't remember the exact numbers, Benny, you might be able to.
No, for sure. So yeah, these numbers, of course, aren't something that we came up with. If you look at organizations like Aon Hewitt, who measures employee engagement, and the Aberdeen Group actually looked at the biggest drivers for engagement, and 27, 2018, number one was work-life balance or performance management, depending on which provider you're looking at. So let your manager telling you where you're at in your job, or having that latitude to manage your task, manage your days with work-life balance. But number two for both Aberdeen Group and Aon Hewitt was career development, training and development. People wanted to have more skills and more in their toolbox to remain employable. So, you know, an engaged organization, people who are engaged, you're getting 3% less absenteeism, 10 to 12% more productivity, and something called salary elasticity, about 14% salary elasticity. So if someone offered me the exact same job across the street, it may take up to 14% more salary for me to move there if I'm engaged. And again, if for us on this call, who are involved in engagement, learning and development, it just shows how powerful our role can be. But back to Emma's question, measuring. I'm going to do a quick parable and kind of lay out, in terms of if your program's effective or not. And of course, you can talk to people like ourselves if you're not sure about strategy or measurement or marketing of your learning. But the parable is Cortez left Spain trying to find. Well, he actually bumped into America. He was trying to find India, bumped into America, sailing the seas with a number of ships, and was supposed to build a fort and have a trading post set up. He had a number of months, and he had a number of boats, and it was taking longer than required. So a few weeks in, he asked his 9 captains why they were going so slow, and they said, in case we fail, we've left some supplies in the boat in case we have to go back to Spain. So they all went to sleep, and they woke up with the boats were burning, and he burned the boats, and he said, there's no going back. So what I'm trying to say here is, if your learning content and your learning delivery and so on isn't as good as YouTube or Netflix, those are the organizations that are burning your boats for you. It has to be as cool and as easy to use, contextualized, easy to use, available on a mobile device and or a workstation interchangeably. Start it on your workstation, finish it on your mobile device, and so on. If it's not as easy to use and as cool as that, your learners are going to find other things to be distracted with.
Yeah, and I think
the message.
I think there's a level of subjectivity to that on that content piece as well, and not just because our businesses focus on the content side, but there is this real thing of the content, it being king or queen. And I think what makes that slightly trickier from an L&D perspective though is that again, what people like from a content perspective is highly subjective. So we've got the layers that we have to factor in versus a Spotify or a Netflix, where it tends to be genre driven. There's also the mode of content that we have to factor in, whether it's auditory, visual, length, and so on. So I think it's, you know, it's really worth spending time thinking about that, because what those learners, you know, if you're an organization of any more than 50 people, that's 50 different people that want to access content in, I would argue, not the same way. So, you know, diversity being the spice of life, or the ability to be able to at least cater for that breadth is really, really critical, because you know, at the end of the day, the technology is obviously critical to be able to deliver content at the right time, but that right content piece is really, really important, because you get that.
Yeah, well, you know, ideally, I would say that hopefully you're dealing and partnering with organizations that have the breadth of content you're looking for, because you're going to have meet the needs of many, many people. And secondly is hopefully you're partnering with organizations that are able to curate properly, because there are so many different assets and different modalities and different things that your jobs as learning and development professionals or HR professionals is to understand your business, understand what types of content are going to align to your strategy, while the rest of the employees not only look at that, but how they're going to you know, meet their skill gaps. And you know, if you're a smaller organization from a learning perspective, but have many, many students, how do you do that? You rely on other partners to curate for you and to help you organize and to help you come up with strategies. So again, it could be our organizations, it could be others. What we're saying is technology agnostic again, but we want you to be aware that those types of things are the things that are going to make your program successful. Yeah. Is understanding again, what your students need and what your business needs.
And just to tie into that, I'm going to flip around the session today and offer some questions that have been asked to you before we give some takeaways to our audience. So I have some questions here from an anonymous attendee. How do we practically get employees to cut through the distractions that we've discussed and consume in that 24 minutes of learning? On top of that, do we think the nuggets of learning available at the point of need via whichever technologies will become part of their workflow organically, or should we invest in socializing it? Have a think on that. The final question in the back of your mind is the fact that companies are investing money into their learning, but should they also be investing time and resources to actually let their employees know what's available and how to access it as well?
I think that most programs have that ability to cater to from the bottoms up and the top down. So letting your organization know what's important, of course, marketing certain pieces that are going to be usable to ensure that the lexicon across a whole organization is the same. Leadership, you know, in many organizations is leadership, but using the same words, or program management or product management, using the same words, the terms, and the same types of tools is going to make it much more effective. So again, from an organizational standpoint, you know, that's going to be important. I think in terms of is it going to be useful? You know, a couple data points. In my hometown, this screen back here is Calgary. The University of Calgary, where I am today, did a study with Harvard Medical School to, and their job was to try to determine how a modern student learned and what was important to them. And I think it really is, if you're expecting your learners to consume in that small period of time, it has to be easy. We can't assume that they're technology savvy. They're actually technology dependent. They're dependent on it being as simple to use, again, as a Netflix, as YouTube, and so on. So they asked their students two things: how do I like to look for information, and how do I like to consume information? 53% said, not surprisingly, they'd like to look for information on the internet. So if you have an internet-based technology or web-based technology that you're using to deploy you're learning, you're meeting that need. And second is they were asked, how do I like to consume information? 51%, and again, they weren't given any, it wasn't multiple choice. They actually were just free form. 51% of people said they wanted to consume information on an iPhone. They didn't say something generic like a mobile device or a laptop, or they actually said an iPhone. And you know, in my continent, USA Today has indicated that the average person spends about 83 hours a month on their mobile device. So again, if the content that you're going to provide is not accessible on an iPhone, it's probably saying something. So I'm going to turn it back to Dan to see if he has anything to add on that.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, again, it comes back to something I was sort of talking about earlier, which is this sort of concept of learning in the flow of work and sort of learning in the flow of life. And I think the two aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, if the two are sort of blurring somewhat. So if we, you know, I think the boundaries between what there is something from Berson's Learning in the Flow of Our Work article that I read about. We don't learn to necessarily be entertained, but to a certain degree, I kind of challenge that a little bit, and especially when we're thinking about the type of content providers out there at the moment, such as Masterclass, etc. But there's also something around the habitual nature of learning and how that can incentivize and create engagement. I do also think, though, that back to a previous point, there's a lot of content out there, there's a lot of information out there, and I can totally understand and see how a lot of this would be overwhelming. I think it's important to be able to look at the informal and formal components as well, because I think, to your point earlier, Benny, you know, people, the barriers to entry, or the friction still does exist to some degree, but if someone wants to find something, they'll just search for it. And, you know, there's such a massive amount of data leakage at the moment that we lose to probably that more informal side of the learning equation, that I think if we're able to think about how we capture, and it's not necessarily that we're sort of wrapping this big loop around the internet, it's also then asking people, like, how are you learning? Where do you go? And creating and curating these experiences that are able to be shared back within the organization. So I think it's a question of not boiling the ocean initially, looking at what technology stack, obviously, but also the content and vendor stack that you have there, to be able to look at saying, okay, well, what can we do? But also then thinking much more about this informal space, because my prediction on that is that it's going to get much bigger in the future, when, you know, and it's already the case that YouTube is probably one of the biggest learning content providers out there. So what are we doing in order to start encapsulating some of that experience, but also the data as well, to continue to inform the other content that we might look in from some more formalized providers?
Yeah, no, for sure. And you know, to be fair, there's lots of other mechanisms that people can be connecting about learning on. I've seen many organizations, in fact, they're using a Yammer or SuccessFactors Jam or Slack, and for lack of a better descriptor, they're like book clubs, except instead of books, they're putting learning assets in there, which could be courses and videos and all sorts of different things that people can comment on, and the trending is going to be there. And it really just understanding, you know, who those influences are in your organization is just another way to, it may not necessarily be under the auspice of learning. You know, that there are folks who are more influential. And in my past organization, when I was a client, that we used to have a CEO letter that went out weekly, and lo and behold, some of the terms that people might not understand were hyperlinks to content that was vetted, you know, previously, and people didn't think it was learning. It was just more of adding context to the CEO letter. So there's different ways to disseminate the information in a way that doesn't seem like it's training that I have to take, but it makes the organization more effective, and it adds to the culture.
Yeah, I like that.
Excellent. So just to kind of finish off and round up on everything you've been talking about today, and nicely you've touched on all these points, but I guess the key takeaway questions to think about in your organization and start thinking about how you might implement it is really around these 3 points. And that would be, you know, find the time, understand when and where your workers typically experience their learning and their gaps in the workflow that can actually be used for focusing on training. Find out where those access points are. How will they simply and conveniently access the training within these moments, preferably through tools they already use on the job. I would argue also outside of the job, and find the value. What training activities will fit into these moments and deliver clear value to motivate them to come back and make everyday training a habit. So at this point, I would like to say a massive thank you to Benny and Dan today for all of their insight. And I'd like to say also thank you to our attendees who've asked some really great questions and given us their time today as well.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks very much indeed. And Benny, it's a pleasure as always. Thanks for that.
Thank you so much for having us on.
Thank you. Take care now, everyone. Bye.